Hello. All right, we are there. We are on our last module now of unit number 5. Let's go ahead and get started with it. So this was a very large unit, cognitive psychology. We are on our last module, which is number 41, and it's about group differences and the question of bias. So we're going to look at if there are differences between genders in terms of mental abilities, differences between ethnic groups and races with mental abilities, and then also what stereotype threat is and how that can influence intelligence scores. So starting with looking at differences between genders in mental abilities, we can see that there was a test done of all Scottish 11-year-olds in the year 1932, and the girls' average intelligence score was 100.6, and boys' average intelligence score was 100.5. So first of all, don't forget our average intelligence score is 100. So this is right on par with that. It makes perfect sense. And basically they have just about the exact same score for their average between boys and girls. So as far as that G factor, general intelligence, is concerned, boys and girls, men and women are basically the same in intelligence. Yet, most people tend to find differences more newsworthy. We tend to focus on, okay, but there's some ways that they're different. So what kind of are those ways that tend to stand out a little bit, even though overall genders are relatively the same in terms of intelligence? So we tend to see that girls outpace boys, meaning they like develop more quickly in that area in terms of spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, and sensitivity to touch, taste, and color. Boys, on the other hand, outperform girls in tests of spatial ability and complex math problems, though in math computation and overall math performance, boys and girls hardly differ. And that last statement there is really, really important to consider because I think that's where socially we see a huge difference between the amount of men versus women that go into STEM fields, like our more mathematic fields, because we tend to think that there is a higher performance of boys than girls in math areas. But as we can see here, overall, there really is not a difference in that. There's just some other ability differences that maybe we see a little bit. So it is important to consider with this entire module here how society influences the way that we perceive intelligence and differences in intelligence. So not just necessarily from what's the like genetic component, but what is an environmental one that has to do with the way society constructs things. So researchers report that culturally influenced preferences help explain why American women more than men avoid math intensive vocations. So again, kind of like I was just mentioning, social expectations and divergent opportunities also shape boys and girls' interests and abilities. And we see in more gender equal cultures like Sweden and Iceland that they exhibit little of the gender math gap found in gender unequal cultures like Turkey and Korea. So where there is more equality amongst genders, they tend to see that there is not much of a gap between the math ability that we tend to see versus cultures where there is a big difference in equality of genders. There is a bigger gap there in math abilities. So very socially influenced for sure. Another way that society kind of influences the ability with our mental intelligence tests and everything is that there was a Barbie doll, for instance, in the year 1992, when if you like press the button on it, she would say, math class is tough. Obviously, their intent here is just to kind of make the doll relatable for children and everything. However, that is such a damaging and stigmatizing statement to make. And that kind of can contribute to that gap that we have between men and women in math fields and everything. Thankfully, a lot of people objected to the release of that doll, and it was kind of quickly pulled off the shelves just a couple of months later because they realized how damaging that phrase can be to young girls who are hearing that. So what about women and math today? So there's this award called the Fields Medal, and that is math's equivalent of like the Nobel Prize that's given every 4 years for outstanding discoveries in mathematics. So we can see here that there is a woman in 2014, an Iranian math professor who became the first woman to win math's most admired award, that Fields Medal. And I love her advice here. She says, if you want to know more about math, practice patience. The beauty of mathematics only shows itself to more patient followers. So I think that's just a great reminder all around. Yet again, kind of goes back to grit. Just keep pushing through because sometimes you just got to be a little patient to get the rewards. So how is that gap narrowing between genders? Since the 1970s, as our gender equity has been increasing in the United States, the boy to girl ratio between 12 and 14-year-olds with very high SAT math scores has declined from 13 to 1 to 3 to 1. So that is obviously a huge improvement in our gender gap there. Still obviously a little bit of room to go, but that is a huge improvement for sure. We're going to try that in class, so I'm not even going to mention this right now. Don't look at this. So the most reliable male edge in mental abilities appears in spatial ability tests like this one that's here. The solution requires speedy mental rotation of three-dimensional objects. So when you're looking at this, this demonstration here, the skills that you need are some spatial abilities and the ability to mentally rotate objects without physically being able to do it. Again, try not to cheat and look at that ahead of class time though. So how do racial and ethnic groups differ in mental ability scores? So I do want to mention here that especially this section of today's lesson absolutely gets into some sensitive topics here. As I mentioned, we are going to be talking about races and differences sometimes that are seen between races. So I do apologize for the sensitive nature of it. And believe me, it's not lost on me that I am a white female teacher, but I do want to bring up some of this research and information that we have here. So there are many group differences in an average intelligence test scores, so like differences between groups of people. So we have seen that New Zealanders of European descent outscore native Maori New Zealanders, Israeli Jews outscore Israeli Arabs, and most Japanese outscore most Biraciman, a stigmatized Japanese minority. So white Americans have outscored Black Americans as well. That is something else we have seen. Again, I'm not trying to make a statement about races. I'm telling you what the research is, but also how that can be explained and maybe some things we can do to try to fix that a bit. So think about each of those differences there, and why do you think maybe we see those differences in intelligence scores between different racial and ethnic groups? I would definitely say this is one of those times where environment is much more of our greater influencer of intelligence here rather than genetics. So let's continue to look at that here. So how does the environment contribute to differences in mental abilities? So we've seen that heredity contributes to individual differences in intelligence, so differences between specific individuals, but group differences, this group of people versus this group of people, that those differences in a heritable trait may be entirely environmental, influenced by factors such as minority oppression, poverty, and war. So I really like this image here to kind of help explain what we mean between the differences of like intelligence differences within a group versus between groups. So for example, like I said, I kind of hate to use this, but it is relevant and can help us see a little bit about how this applies. If we maybe look at one group over here, as I said, we saw that Black Americans tend to score lower on intelligence tests than white Americans. So that would be represented by this side over here, where maybe there's not quite as many nutrients in the soil. If you apply that to the real world in terms of not as many resources and environmental factors that are provided to some Black Americans as are white Americans. So this group over here would be our group of white Americans who maybe are provided with more opportunities and resources and everything. So first, if you're looking at the variation within the group, so if this group is our Black Americans, the differences you see between all of the intelligence scores of one Black American to another Black American, that is something that is influenced by genetics. Same in terms of if you look at one white American to another white American, those differences are influenced by genetics. However, if you're looking at the group of Black Americans compared to the group of white Americans, those differences in intelligence are largely attributed to environment. So as you can kind of see here, even if the variation between members within a group reflects genetic differences, the average difference between groups may be wholly due to environment. So that definitely means that seeing differences in intelligence scores between races and ethnic groups is not something that's because they have different genes, but instead it's because of societal factors and the way that certain races have different opportunities and resources. Again, it's very unfortunate that that's the way things have traditionally been, but hopefully we're starting to take some steps to move forward with that. And eventually, I'm hopeful that one day we'll start to see less of those differences and gaps in a lot of different areas because we're trying to kind of equal out to these opportunities here and everything. So, thinking about that, how alike are humans in terms of genetics? We're actually much more alike than different. And I actually really love to think about that because, we are more similar as humans than we are different. And I just think that's amazing because we tend to focus on people's differences and obviously how maybe you have differences of opinions. But genetically, we are all more similar than we are different. And I think that's kind of cool to think about. So consider that the average genetic difference between two Icelandic villagers or between two Kenyans greatly exceeds the group difference between Icelanders and Kenyans. Also, light-skinned Europeans and dark-skinned Africans are genetically closer than are dark-skinned Africans and dark-skinned Aboriginal Australians. So, I'm sure this is something that's not news to you, but is race a neatly defined category? Definitely not. So, a lot of social scientists see race primarily as a social construct rather than it being something that is genetic differences and those kinds of things. It's not necessarily biological, but instead the way that our society has constructed what race is. So, as each race blends seamlessly into the race of its geographical neighbors, again, meaning that there's really not many genetic differences between races. So, in one genetic analysis of more than 160,000 people living in the United States, most with less than 28% African ancestry said that they are white. And those with more than 28% mostly said that they were African American. So, obviously, again, an example of it's not like we have very neat categories of what race you might be, but instead, it kind of depends on how you identify yourself and the social constructs that go into that. So, how has performance on intelligence tests changed from generation to generation? This is something we talked about a few classes ago, which is called the Flynn effect. As you know, you can see his name right here. So, the Flynn effect is saying how we are seeing an increase in IQ scores with each generation for different reasons, like people being better fed, better educated, and more test prepared today. So the intelligence test performance of our people today exceeds that of the 1930s population by a greater margin than the intelligence test score of the average white person today and how that exceeds the average Black person today. So basically what we're saying here is that there's more of a difference between intelligence between generations than there is between specific races. So that's really interesting to think about, and again, how the environment influences our expression of intelligence. So what does research show about the importance of school and culture? Countries whose economies create a large wealth gap between rich and poor tend also to have a large rich versus poor intelligence test score gap. In China and Turkey, people in poorer regions have the lowest intelligence test scores, and those in wealthier regions have the highest. And finally, Asian students who have outperformed North American students on such tests have also spent 30% more time in school and much more time in and out of school studying math. Yet again, lots more examples of how it's not a genetic component of differences between races and intelligence, but instead environmental factors. So what would you answer here? Which of the following provides the best evidence that race is more of a social construct than a biological category? Take a moment to read through each of your answers here. And that would be letter A. People of varying ancestry may categorize themselves as having the same race because it's just a way that society defines race and yourself rather than biology. Okay, so scientifically speaking, are intelligence tests biased? Are they fair or are there certain biases there? So the scientific meaning of bias hinges on a test's validity. So what is validity again? Remember, validity is the test measuring what is intended to measure. So our example, something we can use is if I'm asking you questions or if I'm trying to measure your psychological intelligence and everything, then I should give you a test that has psychology questions on it rather than math questions if we're trying to see if it's valid or not. So, in this statistical meaning of the term bias, the near consensus amongst psychologists is that the major US aptitude tests are not biased, that they are actually measuring what they're supposed to measure. But what's another way to consider bias? A test could potentially be biased if it detects not only innate differences in intelligence, but also performance differences that are caused by cultural experiences. So, that is something really important to consider with intelligence tests, especially. We do have to make sure that they are appropriately being given to people with cultural backgrounds similar to what is tested on an intelligence test. So, for instance, someone in Japan who is taking an intelligence test that I would also take here in the United States, we might score very differently. And it is not at all because there might be a big difference in our intelligence abilities, but instead because maybe the questions that are asked have more to do with my cultural experiences here in the United States than with their cultural experiences in Japan. We have different societal preferences and things like different ways of life and everything, different priorities as a culture. So that could certainly affect the way that I would answer a question versus someone living in Japan. So another example here is Eastern European immigrants in the early 1900s lacked the experience and language to answer questions about their new culture. So then they were classified as feeble-minded. But intelligence tests are biased in that way, if you're looking at it like that, because they measure developed abilities, which reflect in part your education and experiences. So the answer to are intelligence tests biased, yes or no? Kind of both. It depends. If you're looking scientifically, no, not really. If you're looking in terms of culturally and everything, yeah, kind of. So that's definitely an area that we need to improve upon with our intelligence testing. All right, one last really important term here is stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So basically, it starts with the idea that there's some kind of stereotype about some part of your identity, if it's your gender, your race, your height, your age, whatever it could be. There's some kind of negative stereotype that exists about a specific part of your identity. And then the stereotype threat is that you're kind of afraid you're going to live up to that negative bias. And then a lot of times it tends to end up happening because you're so cognizant of it. You're thinking about it so much that then it leads to it happening. So, for instance, our researchers Stephen Spencer and colleagues gave a difficult math test to equally capable men and women, and the women did not do as well as men. Because think about how we have that stereotype of men tend to be better at mathematical areas than women, which, as we've seen, is not necessarily true, like biologically or anything. That is just a socially constructed stereotype that we have. But they saw that when the individuals had been led to expect that women usually do as well as men on the test, then they actually had pretty similar scores between men and women. So only when there's that stereotype that's kind of being reinforced, we do kind of live up to it sometimes. But if you're trying to some way counteract that stereotype, then you tend to be just fine with it. So expecting to struggle with the math because the stereotype of women as weaker in math existed, the women then performed poorly on the test. So what kind of other research do we have here? So Claude Steele is another huge name associated with stereotype threat. So a few researchers have again observed this self-fulfilling stereotype threat when Black students performed worse than after being reminded of their race just before taking verbal aptitude tests. Because again, as we have seen that there are some differences in intelligence test scores between white individuals and Black individuals. So then if you are specifically calling attention to race right before you take the test, that does lead to that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of I'm going to live up to what this stereotype is about me, my race, whatever, those kinds of things. So follow-up experiments have also confirmed that negatively stereotyped minorities and women may have unrealized academic and professional potential. So basically, we are, as a society, kind of hindering individuals when that should not be the case. It's just that we have these stereotype threats out there that then influence people's performances. So how does it impact test scores? It helps explain why Black individuals have scored higher when tested by Black individuals than when tested by white individuals. Because if you are a Black person being tested by another Black person, race might not be as salient in your mind. It might not be the thing you're focusing on right before you take the test. Versus if you are someone who is Black and you have someone who is white giving you the test, it's just because of the nature of our society, it might be something that stands out to more of, oh, we're different races and I know I might not perform as well because of my race. So this also implies a possible effect of non-Black teachers having lower expectations for Black students than do Black teachers. Again, just kind of reinforcing differences between races when we're actually much more similar than we are different. All right, so I think we need to take a moment here and I gotta play a song for us. Let's listen to this. All right, if you want to listen to the rest, you can. But I just want to say, awesome job. We did it. We made it to the end of Unit 5, which is definitely our largest unit. So great work. Give yourself a nice pat on the back. Congratulations. Let us know if you have any questions and have an awesome rest of your day. See you all later.